Glass shattered somewhere down the hallway, sharp and sudden in a house that was usually silent by midnight. Amara Okafor froze outside a half-open office door, her hand still raised from where she'd meant to knock, watching a man the whole world called a monster fall apart on the floor in front of her. Kang Tae, the man who controlled half the shipping routes between Busan and Lagos, the man 3 governments quietly feared, the man whose name made grown criminals lower their voices in crowded rooms, was on his knees, clutching a small framed photograph to his chest, his shoulders shaking with a grief so violent it looked like physical pain. A second photo frame lay shattered near his feet. The glass he must have knocked over in whatever memory had swallowed him whole. "I thought monsters couldn't cry," Amara whispered, so quietly she barely heard herself say it. He didn't hear her either. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere 12 years in the past, somewhere she had not yet been allowed to see. She should have walked away right then. She had promised herself, the day she signed the marriage contract 3 months earlier, that she would feel absolutely nothing for this man. Not fear, not pity, not curiosity. She had survived 8 years by feeling nothing for anyone, and she was not about to break that streak for a stranger who had bought her the way other men bought property. And yet her feet did not move. Before we go any further, if stories like this one grip you the way it's already gripping you right now, hit subscribe before you keep watching. Trust me, you're going to want to see exactly how this ends. Now let's go back to where it all started, 3 months earlier, in a small flat in Lagos where a girl had already forgotten how to feel anything at all. Lagos was loud at 6 in the morning. Generators humming, hawkers calling out over traffic, church bells competing with mosque calls somewhere in the distance. But Amara Okafor's world had been silent, in the way that mattered, for 8 long years. She was 20 years old, a third-year student at the University of Lagos, and she had not cried since she was 12. Not once. Not at her father's funeral, where relatives had whispered that her stillness was disrespectful. Not the night her mother sold her wedding ring to cover a semester's tuition. Not when classmates called her cold, proud, unfeeling, stone-hearted, and every other word people reached for when they didn't understand that some doors, once shut, simply refused to open again. She simply did not experience things the way other people seemed to. It had started on an ordinary Tuesday evening when she was 12. 3 men broke into their small flat in Surulere while her father was home alone with her mother still returning from the market, and her brother still at football practice. Her father tried to shield her, to buy time, to talk the men down the way he always talked people down, calm, reasonable, steady. One of the men shot him in the chest anyway, right there on the sitting room floor, close enough that Amara felt the heat of it. She remembered every detail with a clarity that never faded. The smell of gunpowder thick in the small room, the sound her father made as he fell, the way his hand reached toward her and never quite arrived, his fingers curling around empty air. She remembered that she did not scream. She remembered her mother arriving moments later, dropping her market bags in the doorway, the sound of oranges rolling across the floor almost comically ordinary against the horror of the scene. She remembered her mother's scream, loud enough for the whole building to hear, loud enough that neighbors came running, loud enough to fill every silence Amara herself refused to fill. She remembered thinking distantly that someone should be crying right now and that the someone should probably be her, and that she simply could not make her body do it. She simply stood there and watched, 12 years old, while the men ransacked the flat and fled into the night, and her father's blood spread slowly across the tile. Neighbors later whispered that the girl hadn't shed a single tear, not at the scene, not at the hospital, not at the funeral 3 days later, where she stood in a black dress 2 sizes too big for her, borrowed from a cousin, her face blank as paper while relatives wept around her in loud, theatrical grief. An aunt had pulled her aside afterward, gripping her shoulders too tightly. "Why won't you cry for your own father? What is wrong with you, Amara?" Amara hadn't had an answer then. She still didn't have one, 8 years later. A doctor examined her weeks later, worried by her unnatural silence, and told her mother gently, in the hallway where he thought Amara couldn't hear, sometimes trauma doesn't create tears. Sometimes it steals them, and it doesn't always give them back. Nobody ever gave hers back. 8 years later, she was still that same girl underneath, Older, taller, sharper, armored in politeness, a young woman who spoke carefully, worked twice as hard as anyone around her, and never once let a person close enough to matter. Her roommate, Funk, had said it best one night over instant noodles. "Amara, do you ever actually feel anything? Like, at all?" "I feel things," Amara had said. "I just don't perform them for other people's comfort." It was a lie, and she knew it even as she said it. She simply didn't feel much of anything anymore, and some nights the emptiness frightened her more than grief ever could have. There had been a boy once, in her second year, Toby, gentle and persistent, who had tried for months to get past the wall she kept around herself. He took her to dinner twice, walked her home from the library more times than she could count, told her once, earnestly, under the fluorescent lights of a nearly empty campus cafe, that he thought he was falling in love with her. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she told him, not unkindly, just honestly. "I know enough," he'd said. "I know you're the smartest person in every room you walk into. I know you never let yourself laugh at anything, even when you clearly want to. I know something happened to you, and I don't need to know what it was to know I'd like to be there when you're ready to talk about it." She had ended things 2 weeks later, gently but firmly, because the alternative, letting someone close enough to see the empty place where her feelings should have been, terrified her more than losing him ever could. Toby had asked her once, near the end, what she was so afraid of. "I'm not afraid of anything," she'd said, and even she hadn't believed it. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, disappointed but not surprised, and walked away, one more person she'd successfully kept at exactly the right distance. Her mother, Mrs. Ngozi Okafor, was the one constant warmth she had left, tired from decades of market trading, hands rough from years of labor, but warm, always warm, even when there was nothing left to be warm about. So when the diagnosis finally came back, chronic kidney failure, stage 4, dialysis needed immediately, a transplant needed eventually if she was to survive at all, Amara felt something crack open in her chest for the first time in years. Not tears. Something colder. Something closer to panic dressed up as calm. "How much will all of this cost, total, if we're being honest?" Amara asked the doctor outside the ward, her voice steady even as her stomach turned. The number he gave her sounded like a joke. It wasn't. She sat down that night with a notebook and a calculator, rearranging numbers that refused to work no matter how many ways she turned them. School fees. Rent. Food. Dialysis, 3 times a week, indefinitely. There was no version of the math that ended anywhere but disaster. She thought about dropping out of school to work full-time. She thought about asking her aunties, though she already knew what answer she would get. Sympathy wrapped around empty hands, since everyone in the family was already stretched thin from helping however they could since her father died. She thought about the small life insurance payout that had run out years ago, spent on rent and uniforms and the ordinary cost of simply staying alive. Her mother, weak as she was, noticed the calculator still glowing on the table at 2 in the morning and called softly from her bed. "Amara, come here." Amara sat on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's thin hand in hers. "I don't want you carrying this alone," her mother said. "Not the way you've carried everything alone since your father died." "Who else is going to carry it, Mama?" Amara asked, and for once there was no flatness in her voice, only exhaustion, only fear finally slipping through the cracks. Her mother studied her for a long moment, something sad and knowing passing behind her tired eyes. "You've been so strong for so long. I sometimes forget you're only 20. I worry some nights that you gave up too much of yourself the day your father died, and none of us ever helped you get it back." "I'm fine, Mama," Amara said automatically, the same lie she'd been telling for 8 years. Her mother only squeezed her hand, unconvinced, and said nothing more, because there was nothing left to say that either of them hadn't already said in silence, over and over, for 8 long years. As if the universe wanted to test exactly how much one family could survive at once. That same week her 17-year-old brother, Chitty, came home shaking, his phone buzzing nonstop with messages that made his hands tremble as he read them. "Amara," he said, barely able to get the words out, "I borrowed money from some men to help with Mama's deposit. I didn't want to tell you. I thought I could pay it back before you found out, but the interest, Amara, the interest keeps growing. And now they're saying... Saying what, Chitty? Amara's voice was sharp, the first real edge she'd shown in months. He held out his phone, hands still shaking. The message was short, and it did not need explaining. Pay by the end of the month, or we deal with you directly. We know your house. We know your sister's school. Amara read it twice, her jaw tightening, and said nothing for a long moment. I'm sorry, Chitty whispered. I didn't know what else to do. It's not your fault, she said, though her voice betrayed exactly how frightened she was. We'll figure it out.
She didn't know how.
She sat awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling, running through every option she could think of, a second job, a loan she couldn't qualify for, relatives who had already given everything they could spare years ago. Every road led back to the same wall. Then, on a Thursday afternoon exactly 1 week later, a black car pulled up outside their compound, sleek and out of place against the dusty street, and a well-dressed Korean businessman stepped out holding a slim leather folder. Miss Okafor, he said in careful, precise English. My name is Han Min-jun. My employer has asked me to bring you a proposal. It is unusual, but I believe it will resolve every difficulty your family is currently facing. Amara crossed her arms, studying him carefully. I'm listening. My employer is Mr. Kang Tae, based primarily in Seoul, with substantial business interests here in Lagos as well. He requires a wife. A marriage real in every legal sense, for a period of no less than 1 year. In exchange, he will fully fund your mother's treatment for as long as it is needed, clear your brother's debt in its entirety, and guarantee your education continues without interruption, wherever you choose to pursue it. Amara almost laughed, though nothing about it was funny. You want to buy me? I am offering you a contract, Mr. Han corrected, unbothered by her tone. Nothing more, nothing less. You may negotiate its terms. You may set whatever boundaries you require. Mr. Kang does not tolerate cruelty toward the women in his household, in any form. He is not the man the newspapers describe. Amara studied his face for any flicker of a lie and found none. Why me? She asked. Out of every woman in the world, why send a car to my street? Mr. Han hesitated, just slightly, just enough for Amara to notice. That is a question you may put to him directly, Miss Okafor, if you choose to accept. Before she could give him an answer, the loan syndicate's men returned, not by phone this time, but in person, 2 of them standing at the edge of the compound in broad daylight, unbothered by the neighbors watching from their windows. Amara stepped outside to meet them before they could reach the door. Your brother owes us, the taller one said, chewing on a toothpick, utterly unhurried. We are patient people, but patience has a price too. You'll be paid, Amara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Give us until the end of the month. We already gave you until the end of the month, the man said, smiling without warmth. That was last week's promise. Today we came to remind you what happens to families who forget their debts. He nodded toward Chitty's window, where her brother stood frozen behind the curtain, and the threat needed no further explanation. Mr. Han, still standing by his car at the edge of the compound, watched the exchange in silence, his expression unreadable. Only after the 2 men finally left, unhurried, did he step forward again. You see now why time is not a luxury you have, Miss Okafor, he said quietly. My employer's offer does not simply solve a financial problem. It solves this one, today, permanently. Amara looked back at her brother's window, then at her mother's, then finally at Mr. Han's folder still resting in his hand. She thought of her mother's frail hands folded on a hospital blanket. She thought of her brother's terrified eyes, the phone shaking in his grip, and now the men standing at their gate in broad daylight. She thought of a stranger named Kang Tae, a name she had never heard before that afternoon, and the strange calm certainty in Mr. Han's voice. Will he expect me to love him? She asked quietly, the only question that actually mattered to her. No, Mr. Han said simply. That was the only promise she needed. She signed the papers 3 days later, in a small, cold office that smelled faintly of ink, her hand steady on the pen even though her entire life was about to change beyond recognition. The night before her flight, Chitty found her packing the single suitcase she was allowed to bring, folding the same 3 dresses over and over as though the act of folding could somehow delay her departure. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly from the doorway. "We'll find another way. I'll drop out, get a full-time job, whatever it takes." "There is no other way, Chitty," Amara said, not unkindly. "You know that as well as I do." "This is my debt," he said, his voice cracking. "You shouldn't have to pay for my mistake with your whole life." Amara set down the dress she was folding and crossed the room to sit beside him on the bed. "It's not your mistake. It's a system that preys on people who don't have any other options. You didn't do anything wrong except try to help Mama the same way I'm trying to help her now." "What if he's cruel to you?" Chitty asked. "What if the newspapers are right about him?" "Then I'll survive it," Amara said. "I've survived worse things than a stranger's cruelty. What I can't survive is losing you or Mama because I was too afraid to do something difficult." Chitty pulled her into a hug, the first real embrace either of them had shared in longer than Amara could remember, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself hold on tightly instead of pulling away first. "Come back to us," he whispered. "Whatever happens over there, come back." "I will," she promised, though she had no idea in that moment exactly what kind of woman would be coming back or when. If you were in Amara's position right now, your mother dying, your brother in danger, a stranger's signature away from saving them both, would you have signed? Type yes or no in the comments before you keep watching, because I promise you, this decision is only the beginning. Seoul did not look anything like what Amara had imagined on the long flight over, her forehead pressed to the window, watching an unfamiliar country rise up beneath the clouds. She had braced herself for danger. Armed guards stationed at every corner, cold marble hallways, colder eyes following her every move. Instead, the car passed through quiet iron gates into an estate lined with tall maple trees, and the mansion waiting at the end of the driveway looked, if anything, almost lonely in its elegance, far too large for whatever life actually happened inside it. An older woman in a simple gray hanbok greeted her at the door, her expression kind but carefully neutral. "Welcome, Miss Okafor. I am Mrs. Song, head of this household. Please come in out of the cold." Amara stepped inside, her suitcase wheels echoing loudly against the polished floors. "Where's Mr. Kang?" "He will meet you shortly," Mrs. Song said. "He insisted on greeting you himself, rather than sending someone in his place, as is sometimes the custom in households like this one." Amara didn't know what to expect. She had seen the grainy photographs the tabloids loved to print, a tall man in dark suits, always turned slightly away from the camera, always surrounded by people whose entire job seemed to be making sure he was never truly seen by anyone. When Kang Tae finally walked into the room, Amara felt something close to disbelief settle over her. He was tall, yes. Broad-shouldered, yes, in the way of a man who had once needed to be physically imposing and never quite lost the habit. But there was nothing menacing in his posture, nothing predatory in his eyes. His hair was more silver than black at 50, and his eyes carried a tiredness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with something much heavier. He wore no jewelry, no obvious display of the wealth Mr. Han had described, just a plain dark sweater, like a man actively trying to take up less space in his own house. He bowed to her, slow and deliberate, more respect than she had expected from anyone in this arrangement. "Welcome home." Amara only nodded, giving him nothing more. She had promised herself she would offer this man politeness and nothing else. "You must be exhausted from the flight," he said, his English careful but fluent. "Mrs. Song will show you to your room. If there is anything you need, anything at all, no matter how small, you have only to ask." "I don't need anything," Amara said, flat and final. Something flickered across his face, not offense, something closer to quiet recognition, as though he understood exactly what kind of armor that sentence was, but he only nodded again. "Of course. Rest well." On the morning of the wedding, Mrs. Song helped her into the simple pale dress, fastening the small buttons at the back with careful, practiced hands. "Are you frightened?" the older woman asked gently, watching Amara's reflection in the mirror. "I don't know what I am," Amara admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. I thought I would feel something today. Fear, maybe. Relief. Anything. I just feel far away from all of it, like I'm watching someone else get dressed. That is not unusual, Mrs. Song said. Many people feel that way on days that change everything. The feeling catches up eventually. It always does, in its own time. What if it doesn't for me? Amara asked quietly. What if I really am as empty as everyone always says? Mrs. Song set both hands gently on Amara's shoulders and met her eyes in the mirror. Empty people do not ask questions like that one, child. Only people who are afraid of feeling too much ask them. She smoothed a final wrinkle from the dress and stepped back. You are not empty, Miss Okafor. You are simply guarded. There is a difference, and I suspect, given enough time in this house, you'll discover it for yourself. The wedding, 3 days later, was small, quiet, and utterly without romance. No flowers thrown, no music, no laughter, no guests beyond 2 required witnesses, and a registrar reading vows in a tone as flat as a legal filing. Amara wore a simple pale dress Mrs. Song had chosen for her. Joon wore a plain black suit. Neither of them smiled for the single required photograph. Her first night in that house, alone in a room 3 times the size of her old bedroom in Suralere, Amara had lain awake for hours, jet-lagged and disoriented, listening to unfamiliar sounds through unfamiliar walls, the hum of a heating system instead of a generator, silence instead of Lagos traffic, a stillness so complete it felt almost suffocating after a lifetime of noise. She had cried that first night, not the deep, cathartic tears that would come later, but small, frustrated, homesick tears, the closest thing to real feeling she had allowed herself in years, quickly wiped away and never mentioned to anyone. In the morning, Mrs. Song had noticed the redness around her eyes, but said nothing beyond a gentle, "Breakfast is ready whenever you're ready, dear." No rush at all. The kindness of it, offered without demand or explanation, had nearly undone Amara all over again, and she'd had to excuse herself to the bathroom to compose her face before she could sit down at the table. It took nearly 2 weeks before she stopped flinching every time a door closed too loudly, before she stopped bracing herself each morning for whatever cruelty she still half expected to arrive. It never came, and slowly, cautiously, some small, guarded part of her began to lower its guard, 1 careful inch at a time. The tabloids exploded within hours of the news breaking. Korean underworld boss marries 20-year-old African bride. What is he hiding? One headline read. Another was crueler. Bought and paid for. Inside Kang Tae-jun's latest acquisition. Amara read the second one over breakfast the next morning and felt nothing but a distant, clinical disgust at how quickly strangers had decided they understood the entire shape of her life from a single photograph. She had prepared herself, quietly and thoroughly, for the worst version of married life. She had expected locked doors, demands, cruelty dressed up as authority, because that was the story the world had told her about men exactly like Kang Tae-jun. None of it came. The first real test came only 10 days into the marriage, when Amara insisted on going to the local market alone, tired of being trailed everywhere by quiet, watchful staff. Tae-jun didn't forbid it, though she half expected him to. Take Jiwoo with you at least, he said. Not as a guard. As a friend who happens to speak the language. I don't need a babysitter, Amara said. She isn't one, he said simply. But Seoul is loud and unfamiliar, and I would rather you have someone beside you the first few times, even if you never need her again after that. Amara went, reluctantly, and found herself grateful for the company within the hour, lost twice in a maze of stalls she couldn't read the signs for. Jiwoo laughed kindly at her frustration rather than mocking it, and by the end of the afternoon, over shared bowls of tteokbokki at a street stall, Amara found herself talking, actually talking, more than she had to anyone in years, about small, unimportant things. The weather. A professor she'd once liked. Nothing that mattered, and everything that did, because for an hour she simply existed as a person and not a girl carrying grief like a second skin. When she returned to the estate that evening, Tae-jun was waiting near the door, not obviously, Not as though he'd been standing there the whole time, but close enough that she suspected he had been anyway. "How is the market?" he asked, careful to keep his tone light.
"Loud," she said.
"Confusing." "Good, actually." Something in his face eased, a tension she hadn't noticed until it was gone. "I'm glad." "You are worried," she said, studying him. "I am always a little worried," he admitted. "It doesn't mean I would ever stop you from living your own life. There's a difference between worry and control. I promised myself a long time ago I would never confuse the two again." He never once entered her room without knocking first, not even after she was legally, formally his wife. He ate breakfast alone in the kitchen most mornings unless she chose to join him, and even then he waited patiently for her to speak first before saying a word himself. Within the first week, an African chef named Mrs. Adiz appeared in the kitchen, hired specifically, Mrs. Song later explained, so Amara would not have to survive on food that only reminded her how far from home she was. He arranged Korean lessons for her with a gentle young tutor named Jiwoo, then told her plainly the very first day, "You are not obligated to continue these lessons. This is only for you, if and when you want it." Every boundary she set, spoken or silent, he respected without a single word of protest. It should have made her curious. Instead, it made her deeply suspicious. In her experience, kindness like this was usually the setup for something far worse waiting just beneath the surface. But the worst never came. Days folded into weeks, and the cruelty she braced for simply never arrived. If a man this feared by the entire criminal underworld can be this patient with a stranger he legally owns nothing over emotionally, what is he actually hiding underneath it all? Drop your theory in the comments below before we go any further, because I promise you, it is not what you think. 2 weeks into the marriage, Amara tested him without meaning to. A week earlier, at dinner, she had made the mistake of admitting she used to love painting back when she was younger, before grief had swallowed most of her hobbies along with everything else. She hadn't thought much of the comment. Joon apparently had. She found the small studio 3 days later, tucked into an unused sunroom on the mansion's east wing, easels, fresh canvases, a full set of paints still in their original packaging, and a note in careful handwriting on the table. No pressure to use any of it. "I only wanted you to have the option in case you ever want it back." She stood in the doorway for a long time before she finally picked up a brush. She didn't paint anything meaningful that first day, just color, messy and undisciplined, the kind of thing a child might make. But something about the act of creating instead of simply enduring loosened something in her chest she hadn't realized was still clenched shut. She kept at it in stolen hours over the following weeks, and though she never showed anyone what she made, she noticed, eventually, that she had started humming quietly to herself while she worked, something she hadn't done since she was 12 years old. She had a nightmare, the old one, the familiar one, gunfire and her father's hand reaching for her, and she woke gasping in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar country, momentarily unable to remember where she was. She stumbled into the hallway in the dark, disoriented, and nearly collided with Joon, who was still awake at that hour, a cup of tea untouched in his hand. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately, taking a careful step back to give her space rather than closing the distance between them. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the lie coming out of her before she could stop it. He studied her face in the low light for a moment, then simply nodded. "There's tea in the kitchen if you want it. I'll be in my study if you need anything. You don't have to explain." He turned to leave without another word, without pressing her, without demanding the story behind her fear the way she half expected any husband, real or otherwise, to demand. "Wait," she said, surprising herself.
He stopped.
"How did you know not to ask?" she said. "Everyone always asks. What happened? Why are you like this? What's wrong with you?" "Because I know what it looks like when someone is drowning in something they're not ready to name," he said quietly. "Asking too soon only makes people drown faster. I learned that the hard way." Amara said nothing, but she did not go back to her room immediately either. She followed him, quietly, into the kitchen, and sat across from him while he made a second cup of tea and slid it toward her without comment. They did not talk about her nightmare. They did not talk about much of anything. But for 20 minutes, In a foreign kitchen at 3 in the morning, Amara Okafor sat in the presence of another human being and did not feel the need to run. A month later, he took her, carefully, formally, with 2 extra guards trailing at a respectful distance, to visit the orphanage marked in his calendar every month. She hadn't asked to come. He had simply mentioned it in passing over breakfast, almost as an afterthought, and she had surprised herself by asking if she could join him. The children swarmed him the moment he stepped through the gate, calling his name, tugging at his sleeves, and for a moment Amara barely recognized the man in front of her. He crouched low, let a small girl braid a section of his silver hair with clumsy, delighted fingers, and laughed. Actually laughed, a sound Amara had not yet heard from him in the weeks she'd known him. "They don't know who you are outside these walls," she said quietly, watching from the doorway. "They know exactly who I am," he corrected gently, not looking up from the boy now showing him a drawing of a dragon. "This is who I am. The other version is just the price I paid to build this." "Was it worth it?" she asked. "The price?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting to somewhere far past the children in front of him. "I ask myself that every day. Some days the answer is yes. Some days it isn't. I try to make today one of the yes days, for their sake if nothing else." On the drive home, Amara found herself watching him differently than she had that morning. Not with suspicion, not with the careful distance she'd maintained since Lagos, but with something dangerously close to warmth. "Why do you keep trying with me?" she asked suddenly. "I've given you almost nothing back. Not warmth, not gratitude, barely even conversation. Any other man would have stopped trying weeks ago." Joon kept his eyes on the road for a moment before answering. "Because trying isn't a transaction, Amara. I'm not keeping score, waiting for you to pay me back in kindness. I made you a promise the day you signed that contract, that you would never have to perform anything for me you didn't actually feel. I intend to keep that promise whether you ever warm to me or not." "That's a strange way to run a marriage," she said. "It's the only way I know how to run one that doesn't end the way my first one did," he said quietly, and then said nothing further, and Amara did not push him for more. Not yet. She had learned in these few short weeks that some doors open faster when you stopped pulling at them. Weeks folded quietly into each other. Amara began, almost without meaning to notice things she had not allowed herself to notice about anyone in 8 years. She noticed that Taejun's staff did not fear him the way outsiders assumed they would. They adored him, openly and without hesitation. The gardener's small son ran to greet him nearly every morning with a crayon drawing clutched tightly in his fist, and Taejun always crouched down to his level and examined it with the same seriousness he might give an important business contract, asking real questions about the colors, the shapes, the story behind it. She noticed that when one of the maids mentioned, quietly and almost apologetically, that her father had fallen seriously ill back in her hometown, Taejun quietly covered the entire hospital bill without being asked, without ever mentioning it to anyone. Amara only learned of it because Mrs. Song let it slip over tea one afternoon, then immediately looked as though she regretted saying anything at all. She noticed a folder left open on his desk one evening when she passed his office. Scholarship names, dozens of them, half written in Korean script, half unmistakably African names she recognized the shape of even without reading them closely. She noticed the same appointment recurring in his calendar every month, always the same time, always the same location marked in careful handwriting, an orphanage on the outskirts of Seoul. None of it matched the headlines. None of it matched the fear she'd seen flicker across strangers' faces the one time his name came up at a market stall. A tabloid photographer caught them together outside a restaurant one evening, and by morning the headlines had turned uglier than ever. Gold digger or hostage? Questions grow over Kang's young bride. Amara found the article on her phone before Taejun could intercept it, and something about seeing herself reduced to those two ugly options, gold digger or hostage, nothing in between, nothing human, made her hands shake with an anger she hadn't expected. "They don't know anything about me," she said when Taejun found her sitting rigidly at the kitchen table. "They don't," he agreed. "And they never will, unless you choose to let them. You don't owe the world an explanation for your own life, Amara." "It's not fair to you either," she said. They're tearing you apart in every headline and you never say anything back. I stopped defending myself to strangers a long time ago, he said. It doesn't change their minds. It only costs me more of myself than I'm willing to spend on people who've already decided what they believe. He paused, studying her carefully. Does it bother you? What they say? Amara considered the question honestly, maybe for the first time. It shouldn't. I don't care what strangers think of me. But I don't like what they say about you, and I don't understand why that bothers me so much. Joon didn't answer immediately, but something in his expression shifted, gentle and searching, as though he were turning her words over carefully before setting them down somewhere safe. Maybe, he said finally, it bothers you, because you're starting to care what happens to me. That isn't something you have to be afraid of, Amara. It isn't a weakness. I don't know how to do it without being afraid, she admitted quietly, the words costing her more than she expected them to. Neither did I once, he said. You don't have to know how yet. You only have to be willing to try. One evening, he found her sitting alone in the garden and held out a small bundle of delicate white flowers, almost shyly, like a boy uncertain whether his gift would be welcome. These only bloom for about 2 weeks each year, he said. I thought you might like to see them before they're gone. Amara looked at the flowers. She looked at him, and something in her, something old, something deeply practiced, refused to let itself soften, even now. You can't make me feel any emotion, she said, her voice flat, almost cold, watching his face closely for the crack in his patience she had been waiting for since the day she arrived. Instead, he only smiled, a small, sad smile, the kind that belonged to a man who had heard far worse and survived it without complaint. I wasn't trying to, he said quietly. He set the flowers gently on the bench beside her and walked away without another word, and Amara sat there a long time afterward, unsettled by how much that simple, unbothered answer had cost her. That night, unable to sleep, restless in a way she couldn't name, she wandered the quiet halls of the mansion and heard something she never expected to hear inside that house, the unmistakable sound of a grown man crying, low and broken, somewhere down the corridor. She followed it, half against her own better judgment, to the door of his private office, left slightly open. Kang Tae, the feared boss, the man 3 governments quietly watched, the man who had built an entire empire out of other people's fear, was on his knees on the floor, a framed photograph pressed hard against his chest, his whole body shaking with a grief that looked decades old and freshly torn open all at once. Amara stood frozen in the doorway, unable to look away. The photograph, she could just make out from where she stood, was of a little girl perhaps 12 years old, laughing brightly at something outside the frame. Around the room, she noticed now for the first time, dozens of children's drawings were pinned carefully to the walls, birthday cards yellowed with age, small handmade keepsakes arranged with obvious, painstaking care, like a shrine no one else was ever meant to see. I thought monsters couldn't cry, she had whispered then, the moment we opened the story on. She did not know what to do with what she was witnessing. She only knew, with a certainty that genuinely frightened her, that she needed to leave before he noticed her standing there. She backed away quietly and returned to her room, but sleep did not come. For the first time in 8 long years, something stirred in her chest that was not numbness. It felt unmistakably and uncomfortably like curiosity. If you've ever completely misjudged someone the way Amara did here, comment, I felt this below right now. And if this story already has you hooked, and I think it does, smash that like button before you keep reading. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more people who need to hear them. It was Mrs. Song, 3 days later, over tea in the quiet kitchen, who finally told Amara the truth. Not because Amara pushed for it directly, but because the old woman seemed to sense that Amara needed to understand, for her own sake as much as for his. He was not always like this, Mrs. Song said, stirring her cup slowly, her eyes distant. Once, he was worse than any story you've heard. Colder. Far more dangerous. He built everything with his own 2 hands, out of nothing, and he trusted almost no one alive. What changed him? Amara asked, setting her cup down carefully. Mrs. Song's face grew heavy, older somehow, in the space of a single breath.
His daughter.
Hannah. Amara went very still. She was 12 when it happened. Mrs. Song continued, her voice quieter now. A rival organization wanted to send Mr. Kang a message he could never ignore. They took her from just outside her school gates, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses who were too afraid to intervene. He gave up everything they asked for, territory, money, entire networks he had spent 20 years building.
None of it mattered to them in the
end. They killed her anyway, Amara said quietly. It wasn't really a question. Mrs. Song nodded, her eyes shining now with old, familiar grief. He has never forgiven himself, not for one single day since. He believed his empire was strong enough to protect anyone standing beneath his name, everyone except the one person he loved above all else. After she was gone, he began quietly giving pieces of that empire away. Scholarships, shelters, hospitals here and abroad. He has spent 8 years trying to become a man his daughter would never have to be ashamed of, even though she is no longer here to witness any of it. Amara sat in silence, the pieces of the man she had so thoroughly misjudged slowly rearranging themselves into something she had never expected to find. Why did he choose me? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Out of every woman in the world, why send a car to a stranger's street in Lagos? Mrs. Song hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small, worn diary, its cover soft and faded with years of handling. Hannah kept this. He has read it more times than either of us could count. There is a page he marked long ago. I think it is time you saw it for yourself. Amara took the diary with careful hands and read the marked page slowly, twice, her chest tightening with every word. Dad, if you ever meet someone whose eyes look as lonely as mine used to be before you made me feel safe, please protect her. Everyone deserves someone who stays, even when it's hard. Amara closed the diary gently, her throat unexpectedly tight, her eyes stinging in a way that frightened her more than it should have. He saw something in you, Mrs. Song said softly. Not his daughter. He would never insult her memory by trying to replace her. He loved her too deeply for that kind of lie. He saw the same loneliness Hannah once carried inside her, and he could not walk away from it once he recognized it. That is the kind of man grief slowly made him become. What was she like? Amara asked quietly. Hannah. Before. Mrs. Song's eyes softened at the question, as though grateful someone had finally asked. Bright.
Stubborn.
She used to sneak into the kitchen at midnight and steal rice cakes, thinking no one noticed, though of course we always did. She wanted to be a doctor like you. She used to bandage the gardener's cat every time it got into a fight, whether the cat needed it or not. She laughed softly at the memory, then sobered. She loved her father fiercely, even though she knew, in the way children sometimes know things without being told, exactly what kind of work he did. She used to tell him, "One day you'll stop, and I'll help you become someone else." He believes, I think, that in some way she still did. Just not in the way either of them imagined. Amara sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere new inside her chest. He's still trying to become who she wanted him to be, even now. Every single day, Mrs. Song said. That is not the behavior of a man pretending, Amara. Grief does not sustain performance for 8 years. Only love does that. Amara sat quietly for a long moment, turning the diary over in her hands one more time before passing it back. Does he know you told me? No, Mrs. Song admitted. And I would rather you not mention it directly, not yet. Let him show you in his own time, in his own way. Some truths are heavier when they're handed over instead of discovered. Why tell me at all, then, if you didn't want me to say anything? Mrs. Song's expression softened into something almost maternal. Because I have watched this man mourn alone for 8 years, and I have watched you carry your own grief the same silent way for 8 years as well. I thought, perhaps, if you understood him a little sooner, you might stop waiting for him to prove himself and start letting yourself feel whatever it is you have clearly been fighting since the day you arrived. Amara didn't answer that directly, but she didn't deny it either, and Mrs. Song, wise enough to recognize progress when she saw it, simply patted her hand once and rose to refill the kettle, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts and a diary's worth of a stranger's love still settling somewhere new inside her chest. Before Amara could find any words to respond, the fragile peace of the moment shattered completely. A guard burst into the kitchen without knocking, breathless, his radio crackling urgently with static and panic. "Madam Song, we have a serious problem. It's happening now." "What is it?" Mrs. Song demanded, already rising to her feet. "The Choi organization," the guard said, his voice tight with tension. "They know Mr. Kang married again. Word reached them faster than we anticipated. They believe she can be used against him. Used as leverage." Amara's blood ran cold. Used how exactly? The guard did not answer directly, and he did not need to. The grim look on his face said everything words couldn't. Someone was already coming for her. Things are about to escalate fast from here. If you don't want to miss what happens next, subscribe right now, because this is the exact turning point everything in this story has been quietly building toward. Joon called an emergency meeting in the security office the moment he heard, his calm exterior cracking for the first time since Amara had arrived in his home. "How did they find out this quickly?" he demanded, pacing the length of the room. "Someone inside the registrar's office likely sold the information," Mr. Han said grimly. "The Choi organization has been waiting for years for exactly this kind of opening. A wife is a weakness they've never had before, sir. They intend to exploit it." "How large is their reach here?" Joon asked, his jaw tight. "Large enough to be dangerous, sir, but not as large as it once was. You saw to that yourself. Years ago," Mr. Han said carefully. "They have been waiting for an opportunity to rebuild what they lost. A wife is exactly the kind of opportunity they've been hoping for." "And you believe they would actually move against her? Not simply threaten?" "The Choi organization has never been interested in empty threats, sir. You know this better than anyone alive." The silence that followed said more than either man wanted to admit aloud. Joon closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment, Mr. Han watched something old and haunted pass behind his employer's face, the same expression he realized that he had seen exactly once before, 8 years earlier, in the days before everything had fallen apart the first time. "Double the security around the estate," Joon ordered, his voice tight but controlled. "No one enters or leaves without clearance. She does not go anywhere unescorted, not even to the garden." Amara, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, bristled at being discussed like a piece of cargo. "I'm right here. You can talk to me directly." Joon turned to her, his expression softening only slightly under the weight of his worry. "Amara, I need you to understand how serious this is. These are not empty threats. The Choi organization does not make empty threats." "I understand danger," she said quietly. "I watched my father die in front of me when I was 12. I know exactly what these men are capable of." Something in his face broke a little at that, some new understanding of her settling into place, but there was no time to dwell on it. The threat was already moving faster than any of them anticipated. 2 nights later, against every precaution, the abduction happened anyway, fast, brutal, and entirely without warning. Amara was walking from the car to the front gate, having just returned from a rare supervised afternoon out with Mrs. Song, her guard momentarily distracted by a phone call, when 3 men in dark clothing emerged from the shadows of the trees lining the estate wall. She barely had time to scream before a gloved hand clamped over her mouth and a cloth soaked in something sharp and chemical pressed hard against her face. The world tilted, blurred, and went dark. She woke in a cold, unfamiliar room. Bare concrete walls, a single flickering bulb overhead, her wrists bound tightly to the arms of a metal chair. A man she did not recognize crouched in front of her, smiling in a way that made her stomach turn violently. "Kang Tae Joon's little bride," he said, almost amused, circling her slowly. "He's going to give us absolutely everything to get you back. Every port, every route he stole from us years ago. And if he refuses," the man let the sentence hang, deliberately, cruelly unfinished. Amara did not cry. She did not beg. Whatever else had shifted inside her these past weeks, the old numbness rose up to protect her exactly when she needed it most, and she stared back at the man with a steadiness that clearly unsettled him far more than tears ever would have. "He will come," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "And you have absolutely no idea what that actually means for you." The man laughed, low and mocking, and crouched down to her eye level. "You sound very sure of a man who married you for convenience. Tell me, has he ever once told you he loves you? In all these weeks?" Amara said nothing, because the answer was no, and she refused to hand this stranger the satisfaction of hearing it. "That's what I thought," the man said, straightening back up. "He'll pay for you, because paying is what men like him do. It doesn't mean you matter to him the way you seem to think you do." "You're wrong," Amara said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. "And you're about to find out exactly how wrong you are." The man's smile faded into something colder. His name, though she wouldn't learn it until much later, was Choi Dae-sung. The eldest son of the organization Tae-joon had spent 30 years slowly dismantling a man who had inherited his father's grievances along with his father's title. "You have no idea what your husband took from my family," he said. "Territory built over 3 generations, gone in less than a decade because of him. My father died believing Kang Tae would pay for what he did to us. I intend to make sure that debt is finally collected, one way or another." "He didn't take anything that wasn't already stained with someone else's blood," Amara said quietly, remembering fragments of what Mrs. Song had told her about the empire Tae-joon had inherited and slowly torn apart from the inside. "Maybe your father should have built something worth keeping instead." Choi struck her again for that, harder this time, and this time she did cry out, unable to hold it back completely, but even through the pain, some small, stubborn part of her noted, almost distantly, that she had gotten under his skin far more than he had gotten under hers. "Enjoy the next few hours," he said coldly, straightening his jacket. "They may be your last." He struck her once across the face for her defiance, hard enough that her ears rang, but she did not cry out, and something about her silence seemed to unsettle him more than any scream could have. He left the room without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the single flickering bulb overhead, and Amara sat alone in the dark, blood on her lip, refusing to let herself feel afraid. She thought of her father's hand reaching for her, never arriving. She thought of Tae-joon crouched on the floor of his office, a photograph pressed to his chest. She thought, strangely, of the diary entry Mrs. Song had shown her. "Please protect her, even when it's hard." "Not this time," she whispered to no one. "This time someone comes back for me." Miles away, Kang Tae received the ransom call in his office, the very same office where Amara had once watched him weep on the floor over a photograph. His face went pale, then hardened into something Amara herself had never witnessed, something Mrs. Song had once described and hoped never to see again. The version of him the tabloids had always warned people about. "Give them whatever they're asking for," he told Mr. Han immediately, his voice like iron. "Every route, every port. I don't care what it costs. Sir, if we concede everything at once, the entire organization collapses. 30 years of work, gone in a single night. Are you absolutely certain?" "She is not a bargaining chip," Tae-joon said, cutting him off, his voice low and utterly final. "She is my wife. Get her back safely. That is the only priority that exists right now." Mr. Han studied his employer's face for a long moment, searching for any hesitation and finding none, then nodded once and left immediately to arrange everything that would be needed. Amara sat alone in that concrete room for what felt like hours, testing the ropes around her wrists whenever Choi's men weren't watching, searching the dim edges of the room for anything useful, a loose pipe, a weak hinge, anything at all. She found nothing but cold walls and the flickering bulb overhead, and after a while she stopped searching and simply sat still, conserving whatever strength she had left for whatever came next. She thought about Tae-joon receiving the call. She thought about the look that would cross his face. She had come to know his expressions well enough, these past months, to imagine it clearly. The careful stillness he wore over panic, the way his jaw would tighten before he said anything at all. She thought, too, about the version of herself who had arrived in Seoul 3 months earlier, certain she would feel nothing for this arrangement, certain she could hold herself apart from it entirely. That version of herself would not have been afraid right now, she realized. That version of herself would have simply gone numb and waited it out. She was afraid now. Genuinely, fully afraid. Not just for herself, but for what it would do to Tae-joon if this went wrong, for what it would do to a man who had already lost one person he loved to men exactly like these. The fear surprised her more than the danger did. It meant, somewhere along the way, without her ever quite noticing it happening, she had started caring about someone enough to be afraid of losing him. Please, she whispered to no one, to whatever version of fate might be listening. Not him too. Not because of me. Mrs. Song found Tae-joon a few minutes later, standing motionless at the window of his office, his reflection ghost-like against the dark glass. "You're thinking of Hannah," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I keep hearing the same phone call," he said, his voice hollow. Different voice. Same words. "Give us everything, and we'll return her." I gave them everything the first time. It wasn't enough. "This is not the same situation," Mrs. Song said firmly. "You know these men. You know their operations. You have resources you didn't have 8 years ago." "I had resources 8 years ago too," he said. "I had everything except the one thing that mattered. I wasn't fast enough. I won't make that mistake twice, Mrs. Song. I don't care what it costs me this time. Not the empire, not my life. Nothing matters except getting her out alive." "Then stop standing here talking to me," Mrs. Song said gently, "and go bring your wife home." Alone in his office, Tae-joon sat down heavily, his eyes drifting helplessly to the framed photograph of Hannah still sitting on his desk, and for the first time in 8 years, he spoke to her directly, his voice barely above a whisper, cracked with a fear he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I couldn't save you," he said. "I will not fail her too. I promise you that much." For the first 90 minutes after the ransom call, Tae-joon's men tore through the city searching for any trace of the Choi organization's safe houses, coming up empty at 3 locations in a row while Tae-joon paced his office like a man losing a war he could not afford to lose. "Sir, we have a 4th location," one of his lieutenants finally reported, breathless. "An old warehouse near the docks. It matches the description one of our contacts gave us." "Are you certain?" Tae-joon demanded. "As certain as we can be, without confirming eyes on the ground." "Then we move," Tae-joon said, already reaching for his coat. "Sir, if it's the wrong location, we lose the element of surprise on the real one." "If it's the right location and we hesitate," Tae-joon said, cutting him off, "we lose her. I am not willing to make that trade." The warehouse turned out to be empty, a decoy, and for a single, gutting moment, Tae-joon believed he had failed her exactly the way he had failed Hannah. He stood in the empty building, fists clenched, fighting the urge to put his hand through the nearest wall, when Mr. Han's voice crackled urgently through his earpiece. "Sir, we have her. Real location this time, confirmed. Shipping yard, Sector 9. They're requesting the exchange within the hour." Something in Tae-joon's chest loosened just enough to let him breathe again. "Get everyone moving. Now." The exchange took place 2 hours later at an abandoned shipping yard outside the city, floodlights cutting harsh lines through the darkness, both sides tense, armed, and watching each other for the first sign of betrayal. Tae-joon walked forward alone, unarmed, hands raised, deliberately offering himself as collateral for Amara's safe release, refusing every desperate warning from his own men to stand down and let them handle it instead. "You want the territory, take it," he called out across the yard, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "You want the money, it's already yours. Just let her go, unharmed, right now." The exchange was granted, but not without one final act of violence. As Amara was released and began running toward him across the open yard, one of Choi's men, acting alone in a desperate final betrayal of the agreed terms, raised his weapon and fired a single shot. Choi Dae-sung, watching the chaos unfold from the shadows at the edge of the yard, saw his carefully planned exchange collapsing in real time and made one final, desperate decision. He would not walk away from this with nothing to show for it, not after everything his family had sacrificed to get this close. He raised the weapon himself, and it was his own hand, not one of his men's, that pulled the trigger. Tae-Joon staggered as the bullet struck his side, his knees buckling beneath him as his own guards finally opened fire in response, driving the attackers back hard into the surrounding darkness. Choi himself was struck twice in the exchange, collapsing near the shipping containers, and by the time his remaining men dragged him back into their vehicle and fled the scene, the family debt he had sworn to collect was left unfinished, bleeding out somewhere in the dark just like the man he had failed to kill. Tae-Joon. Amara screamed his name for the very first time since she'd arrived in Seoul, dropping to her knees beside him on the cold concrete as blood spread rapidly across his shirt. "You're safe," he managed through gritted teeth, his voice weak but strangely relieved, as if that single fact somehow made everything else bearable, even this. "That is all that actually matters to me." "Don't talk," she said, pressing both hands hard against the wound, her voice shaking in a way she barely recognized as her own. "Don't you dare die on me. Do you hear me? Don't you dare." If this moment already has your heart racing, imagine what it felt like watching it unfold in real time. Don't forget to like this video right now before you keep going, because what happens next in that hospital hallway is the moment this entire story has been quietly building toward from the very first scene. The hospital hallway smelled sharply of antiseptic and fear, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in a rhythm Amara would remember for the rest of her life. She sat outside the operating room for 6 straight hours, her hands still faintly stained with his blood despite 3 attempts to wash them clean, refusing every offer of tea, refusing every gentle attempt at comfort from the nurses passing by, staring at the closed double doors as if she could will them open through sheer force of will alone. Mrs. Song sat beside her in silence for most of it, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand, and for once in her life, Amara did not pull away from the contact. "He has always been willing to give everything for the people he loves," Mrs. Song said quietly, somewhere around the 4th hour. "It nearly destroyed him completely once before. I was so afraid it would happen again, watching him walk out into that yard alone." "He shouldn't have gone out there without protection," Amara said, her voice tight with barely restrained emotion. "He shouldn't have," she stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to name the fear sitting like a stone in the center of her chest. "Why does it matter so much to you?" Mrs. Song asked gently, watching her carefully. "You told him once, quite plainly, that he could not make you feel anything at all." Amara opened her mouth to answer with the same practiced deflection she always used, and found, for the first time in 8 long years, that she had absolutely no defense left standing to offer. When the surgeon finally emerged from behind the double doors, exhaustion written plainly across his face, he delivered the news carefully and precisely. The surgery was successful. The bullet missed anything vital by less than a centimeter. He is an extremely fortunate man. He will need significant time to recover fully, but he will live. Amara exhaled a breath she hadn't even realized she'd been holding for 6 straight hours, and something inside her chest, something locked tightly shut since she was 12 years old, finally, quietly, began to give way. Mr. Han arrived shortly after with a brief update on Choi Dae-sung, delivered quietly in the hallway so as not to disturb the fragile calm that had finally settled over the group. "He did not survive his injuries, sir, I mean madam," he corrected himself, still adjusting to the fact that Amara, not Tae-Joon, was now the one waiting to receive the news. "The organization has lost its leadership entirely. There is no one left with the standing to continue what he started." "Is it over, then?" Amara asked. "Truly over?" "As over as these things can be," Mr. Han said carefully. "There will always be smaller threats, smaller grudges. But the immediate danger, yes, it is over." Amara nodded, feeling neither triumph nor relief exactly, just a heavy, complicated exhaustion, the kind that came from surviving something rather than winning it. "Thank you, Mr. Han, for everything you did tonight. For everything you've done since the day you knocked on my mother's door." Mr. Han, a man not given to visible emotion after decades in Tae-Joon's employ, seemed genuinely moved by the gratitude. "It has been an honor, Mrs. Kang." Watching this household come back to life these past months has been worth every risk it took to protect it. It was the first time anyone had called her that, Mrs. Kang, and Amara found, to her own surprise, that she did not flinch from it at all. She was allowed in to see him briefly that evening, his face pale against the white hospital pillows, tubes and monitors surrounding him on every side, but his eyes opened the moment she stepped quietly into the room. "You came," he said softly, his voice still rough from the anesthesia. "Of course I came," she said, pulling a chair close beside his bed and sitting down. "You almost died for me tonight. I would do it again," he said simply, without a moment's hesitation in his voice. Amara sat in silence for a long moment, studying the man who had built an entire empire out of other people's fear and then spent 8 quiet years trying to dismantle it piece by piece, the man who had asked absolutely nothing of her, expected nothing from her, and given her everything regardless. She thought of her father, bleeding out on their sitting room floor while she stood frozen 12 years old and unable to make a single sound. She thought of the diary entry, written by a girl she had never had the chance to meet. Please protect her, even when it's hard. She thought of the small white flowers left untouched on a garden bench and the cold, deliberate words she had used to push this man away. And then, without warning, without permission, without any of the years of careful, practiced control she had built so carefully around herself like armor, Amara Okafor began, finally, to cry. Not quiet tears. Not the careful, controlled kind she sometimes managed at difficult funerals or awkward goodbyes. Real, racking, 8 years overdue tears, her shoulders shaking violently, her breath coming in broken, uneven gasps, everything she had buried alive since she was 12 years old finally breaking the surface all at once, all together, impossible to hold back any longer. Joon watched her, his own eyes filling despite his weakened, exhausted state, and reached for her hand with what little strength he had left in him. "Are those tears?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief and something close to genuine wonder. "I didn't know I still could," Amara whispered, gripping his hand tightly, as if letting go for even a moment might undo whatever had just broken open inside her chest. He said nothing more. He simply held her hand as she cried, steady and patient the way he had been from the very first day, and for the first time since she was 12 years old, Amara finally let herself feel everything she had spent 8 long years running from. When the tears finally slowed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed and unguarded all at once. "I don't know what just happened to me." "You grieved," Joon said gently. "Perhaps for the first time since you lost your father. Grief postponed doesn't disappear, Amara. It only waits." "How do you know so much about waiting?" she asked, a small, watery laugh escaping her despite everything. "Because I have been waiting 8 years to feel the way I felt watching you cry just now," he admitted. "Not glad you were in pain. Glad that something in this house finally reached you enough to break through. I was beginning to think nothing ever would." "You almost died," she reminded him. "That's what reached me." "Then I suppose it was worth it," he said, and though his voice was weak, there was no hesitation in it at all. She stayed at his bedside long after the nurses suggested she rest, her hand still folded in his, and somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, for the first time since she'd arrived in his life, Amara Okafor allowed herself to imagine a future she actually wanted to be part of. We are almost at the end of this story now, but the most important choice of all is still ahead of us. If you've made it this far with me, comment your favorite line from the story below, because the ending is about to hit even harder than everything that came before it. 3 weeks later, once Joon was finally strong enough to sit up in his study without assistance, he called Amara in quietly and placed a slim folder gently on the table between them. "Divorce papers," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "You have fulfilled every single part of our original contract in full. Your mother's treatment is complete and paid for as long as she needs it. Your brother's debt has been cleared entirely. Your education is secured for as long as you wish to continue it, wherever in the world you choose to study. You are free to go wherever life takes you from here, Amara. No conditions. No obligations. No debts left owing on either side." Amara looked at the folder for a long, silent moment, then looked back up at him, searching his face carefully. "Is this what you actually want?" she asked quietly. "It was never about what I want," he said softly, his eyes steady on hers. "It was always about giving you a real choice, one you never had before you met me." Amara picked up the folder slowly, opened it, and read the terms she already knew by heart from memory. Then, without a single word, she tore the papers cleanly in half, right there in front of him. Tae-Joon stared at her, completely stunned into silence. "I'm not staying because I owe you anything," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in years, steadier than it had ever been, really. "I'm staying because, for the first time since I was 12 years old, I actually feel something real when I look at you, and I am not ready to let that go."
Not now.
Maybe not ever. For a long moment, neither of them spoke at all. Then Tae-Joon reached slowly across the table and took her hand in his, and this time, Amara did not pull away. "I have one condition of my own, though," she added, a small, unfamiliar smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Anything," he said. "No more secrets in that office of yours. If you're grieving, grieve where I can sit beside you. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Neither of us does." His eyes filled again, and this time he let her see it without shame. That night, for the first time since Hannah's death, he did not sit alone in his office with her photograph. Instead, he brought the framed picture into the sitting room, set it gently on the mantel where anyone could see it, and told Amara stories he had never told another living soul. The rice cake stolen from the kitchen at midnight, the bandaged cat that never actually needed bandaging, the promise his daughter had made him about becoming someone new one day. "She would have liked you," he said quietly, near the end of it. "She always said she wanted a sister. I think, in some strange way I never could have planned, she got one after all." Amara reached over and took his hand. "Then I'll try to make her proud too. Both of you." Mrs. Song, passing by the doorway with a tray of tea she ultimately decided not to interrupt with, paused just long enough to see the photograph sitting openly on the mantel for the first time in 8 years, and smiled to herself before quietly walking on. That evening, Amara called her mother in Lagos, the phone line crackling faintly with distance. "Mama, I have something to tell you." "You sound different," Mrs. Okafor said immediately, her voice warm even through the static. "Happier. Is everything all right?" "Everything is more than all right," Amara said, glancing across the room to where Tae-Joon sat reading, pretending not to listen and failing entirely. "Mama, I think I finally understand what you always told me, that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in pieces, through people who are patient enough to wait for you. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become," her mother said softly. "He always said you had the biggest heart in that house, even when you were too afraid to show it." Amara's eyes filled unexpectedly. "I think I finally believe that now." When she hung up the phone, Tae-Joon set down his book. "Your mother sounds well." "She is," Amara said, crossing the room to sit beside him. "She wants to meet you properly, not as the man from the headlines, as my husband." "I would like that very much," he said. "I have a great deal to prove to her, I imagine." "You do," Amara agreed, smiling despite herself. "She'll ask you 100 questions and judge every answer twice. She judged every one of my old classmates the same way, and none of them survived the interrogation." "I've negotiated with far more frightening people than your mother," Tae-Joon said, though something in his voice betrayed a genuine nervousness that Amara found, unexpectedly, rather endearing. "I don't think you have, actually," she said. "Nobody negotiates like an African mother deciding whether she approves of her daughter's husband." He laughed at that, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the kind she'd first heard from him at the orphanage months earlier and had come, in the time since, to treasure more than she ever expected to treasure anything. "You have nothing left to prove," Amara said, resting her head against his shoulder. "You proved it to me. That's enough." 2 years passed like a long, quiet, steady exhale after years of held breath. Amara completed her medical studies, splitting her time carefully between Seoul and Lagos, eventually taking on a leading role in a new charitable foundation dedicated to funding healthcare and education projects across both countries she now called home. Tae-joon, true to the quiet promise he'd made to her in that hospital room, stepped fully away from the criminal empire he'd spent 30 years building from nothing, choosing instead to face the full consequences of his past honestly and openly, while investing everything he had left into legitimate businesses and genuine philanthropy. The road there was not without its own difficulties. Rebuilding a life out of the wreckage of an empire took longer than either of them expected. There were nights Tae-joon woke from nightmares of his own, old enemies who resurfaced looking for what remained of his territory, journalists who refused to believe a reformed man could ever truly change. There were nights Amara struggled too, the old numbness creeping back in moments of stress, reminding her that healing was rarely a straight line. One evening, nearly a year after the shooting, an anniversary of her father's death crept up on her without warning, and she found herself sitting alone in the dark of the painting studio, unable to explain to anyone, even herself, why the familiar emptiness had returned so suddenly after months of feeling more alive than she ever thought possible. Tae-joon found her there near midnight, knees drawn to her chest, staring at a blank canvas she hadn't touched all evening. "You don't have to tell me," he said gently, sitting down on the floor beside her without asking permission first, the way he always had. "I only wanted you to know you're not sitting in the dark alone tonight." "It's the anniversary," she finally admitted, her voice small. "Of my father. I thought I was past this. I thought healing meant it stopped hurting." "It doesn't mean that," he said quietly. "I still have days like this, even now, even with everything we've built together. Healing doesn't erase the wound, Amara. It just means you're no longer facing it by yourself." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the quiet studio for a long time, saying nothing more, needing nothing more than the simple fact of each other's presence in the dark. But they faced each of those nights together, which was the part neither of them had ever had before. Amara's mother finally traveled to Seoul for the first time 18 months after the wedding, walking slowly but steadily through the mansion gates, and when Tae-joon greeted her with a deep, respectful bow, Mrs. Okafor surprised everyone by pulling him into a firm embrace instead. "My daughter forgot how to cry for 8 years, she said quietly, only for him to hear. "Thank you for reminding her she still could." She reminded herself, Tae-joon said. "I only had the patience to wait for it." Chitty, now finishing his own studies with his debts long behind him, visited that same year and spent an entire afternoon awkwardly trying to intimidate his sister's husband before giving up entirely and simply asking him to teach him how to play baduk instead. Tae-joon obliged, patient as ever, and by evening the two of them were laughing over a game neither of them was very good at. They named the foundation after his daughter. The launch event was held in a modest hall rather than a grand ballroom, at Amara's insistence. "Hannah would have hated anything that looked like it was more about us than the children we're trying to help," she'd argued, and Tae-joon hadn't disagreed. Rows of children from the very orphanage he'd visited faithfully every month for 8 years sat in the front, restless and giggling, utterly unbothered by the weight of the occasion around them. When it came time for Amara to speak, she stood at the small podium, unprepared notes trembling slightly in her hand, and looked out at the room, Mrs. Song near the back, dabbing her eyes discreetly with a handkerchief, her mother and Chitty, flown in for the occasion, sitting proudly near the front, Tae-joon watching her with an expression she had long since stopped needing words to understand. 8 years ago, I stopped believing I would ever feel anything again, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling notes. I built walls so high I forgot there was ever a version of me without them. And then I met a man everyone warned me about, who turned out to be nothing like the story the world had written for him. She glanced at Tae-joon, who held her gaze without looking away. This foundation exists because he taught me that healing doesn't arrive through grand gestures. It arrives through patience. Through someone showing up quietly, again and again, long after you've given them every reason to stop. She looked out at the children in the front row. "We named this foundation after a girl I never had the chance to meet, who once asked her father to protect someone whose eyes looked as lonely as her own. I hope, in some way, every child we help through this work carries a piece of what she wanted for the world. I know I do. The applause that followed was warm and unhurried, and when Amara stepped down from the podium, Joon met her halfway, taking her hand without a word. She would be proud of you, he said quietly, just for her. She'd be proud of both of us, Amara corrected gently. On the anniversary of Hannah's birthday, Amara knelt beside her photograph in the quiet foundation garden, placing fresh flowers beneath the frame with careful hands, and smiled. A real smile, easy and warm, the kind she had once genuinely believed herself incapable of ever again. "Thank you for lending me your father," she said softly, as if the girl in the photograph could somehow hear every word of it. "He helped me find my heart again, after I thought it was gone for good. I hope, wherever you are, you know what kind of man he became because of you." Joon stood beside her in silence, no longer the feared boss the tabloids had once so eagerly described, no longer a man who had bought himself a bride out of quiet desperation and buried grief. Just a father who had finally found hope again, and a husband whose greatest victory had never been power, or fear, or empire, but simply the patience to earn trust honestly, one quiet, unasked-for act at a time, until love finally arrived on its own terms, freely chosen, and completely, unmistakably real. If this story moved you even a little, and I have a feeling it did, that is exactly why we make them. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment below telling us exactly which moment in this story hit you the hardest, and give this video a like before you go, because it genuinely helps stories like this one find the people who need them most. See you in the next one.